I have a personal grievance I would like to discuss publicly, if that's all right with everybody. So, upon my arrival at the departure section of Tel Aviv airport, I would be questioned for 5 to 10 minutes by the first portion of the security personnel after they scanned my passport. Say, what your friend's name? And I would say, Joanna. And they would say, that's not an Israeli name. And I would say, well, I saw her Israeli passport. And they would say, because it was, of course, a trick question, they would say, did you go to any religious services when you were growing up? Which was a way to, suss out if I was Jewish, but they knew I wasn't Jewish because when I filled out my visa application, because I had a year-long student multiple entry visa, I had to tell them directly what my religion and ethnicity was. We sort of had to go through this charade anyway, and then I would eventually be led through to the actual security portion where they would make me take off all my outer layers, so I was just standing there in like my undershirt and a pair of sweatpants, and then they would go through all of my belongings with this little swab to search it for residue. They would open all the pages of my diary. They would go through all of my underwear, my jewelry box, even though I used to have like loose Adderall in there because I do have ADHD. They didn't care about the loose Adderall. They only cared about searching every single page of my archaeology textbooks to see if there was suspicious residue my Palestinian boyfriend had left in there. There was none. So they would, in fact, eventually let me through to my flight to go home. Finally, in the terminal of Tel Aviv airport, a place no one should ever find themselves, I would be greeted by a Hugo Boss. Hugo Boss was trying to keep his parents' clothing company alive after World War I in Germany. When he took over the business in 1922, he registered it as a manufacturer of workwear and uniforms. But like thousands of others, he was swept into the economic storm of the 1920s. By the end of the decade, the company was nearly bankrupt. Boss's factory shrank to just 22 employees and a handful of freelancers. After long negotiations with his creditors, he was allowed to keep only 6 sewing machines, the bare minimum to start again. In 1931, 2 years before Hitler seized power, Hugo Boss joined the Nazi Party. He was member number 508,889. He also became a sponsoring member of the SS, a status that provided financial support to the organization. Later in his life, Boss would claim that he only joined to save his business. By the mid-1930s, after joining the Nazi Party, he had become well-connected in his town. He was able to join local clubs, hunt with influential men, and expand his social circle. His political alignment wasn't just economic, it elevated him socially, transforming him from a struggling artisan into a respected member of the petty bourgeoisie class. In 1934, the company became a licensed supplier for the central authority responsible for regulating Nazi uniforms. This opened the door for contracts with the SS, the Hitler Youth, the Wehrmacht, which was like the normal German army, the SA, and other party organizations. Sales for Hugo Boss in 1932 were 38,268 Reichmarks. In 1941, his sales were 3.3 million Reichmarks. Imagine a Nazi. Think of a famous photograph of the most famous genocide in history. Hugo Boss, the man in the company, enriched themselves putting clothes on that murderer's back. The uniforms that Hugo Boss produced became symbols of terror. They marched through the occupied cities. They stood guard at the concentration camps. They became part of the visual identity of the Third Reich. And to meet demand, the company had to expand rapidly. As the war intensified, Germany faced severe labor shortages. The solution was forced labor. At the Hugo Boss factory, alongside 300 regular employees, were 140 forced laborers, mostly women from Poland and the Soviet Union, along with 40 French prisoners of war. A camp was built near the factory to house them. According to later investigation, hygiene and food supplies were extremely uncertain. Workers lived in cramped quarters. They sewed uniforms for the very regime that had invaded their homelands and taken them captive. In 1944, as the war began to turn against Germany, Boss attempted to improve conditions by requesting permission to house the workers himself and provide better food. For the forced laborers, liberation came when Allied forces advanced. Most were repatriated to Poland and France. They returned to devastated cities, political suspicion, and a life of trauma. The company kept no records of their individual fate. After the war, Germany underwent a process known as denazification. Hugo Boss was initially classified as an activist, supporter, and beneficiary of the Nazi regime, one of the most serious categories. He was fined a mere 100,000 Reichsmarks, stripped of his voting rights, and barred from running a business. But Boss appealed the ruling. He was eventually classified as a follower, a category that implied passive involvement rather than active support, and his fine was reduced even further to 25,000 Reichsmarks. A reminder that in 1941, he made 3.3 million Reichsmarks. Management was passed to his son-in-law, and Hugo Boss died in 1948. In 1950, Hugo Boss received its first order for men's suits, a turning point that would define the brand's future. By 1953, the first Hugo Boss suits appeared on the market. The company grew, it modernized, and it tried to distance itself from the past. In 1999, lawyers representing Holocaust survivors filed legal action against Hugo Boss and other German companies that had used forced labor. This led to a creation of a national compensation fund in 1999. In 2011, after commissioning an independent historical study, the company issued a formal apology for its use of forced labor during the war. Maybe I'm judgmental, but I don't think anyone should be buying from Hugo Boss because it created its success by putting clothes on the backs of concentration camp guards and SS men shooting men, women, and children into mass graves.
Nazi ain't got no humanity. They're the foot soldiers of a Jew-hating, mass-murdering maniac, and they need to be destroyed. That's why any and every some bitch we find wearing a Nazi uniform, they're gonna die.
When they apologized in 2011, it was only for their use of slave labor, not for making the hats with little skulls on them, not for becoming rich by supplying the Nazis, only for using slave labor. Fanta, Volkswagen, IG Farben, Lufthansa, these companies' involvement in the Holocaust is well known. It's a reference.
Hugo Boss did not historically manufacture uniforms for the Nazis. Sorry, this Hugo Boss did not historically manufacture uniforms for the Nazis.
But it very rarely seems to influence anyone's purchasing decisions. Settler colonialism is a form of colonialism in which outsiders move into land, permanently settle there, and work to replace or dominate the indigenous population, socially, politically, and often demographically. It is not just about ruling a territory, it is about taking it and making the settler society the primary one. I did actually know a few Americans who had moved to Israel from the United States, and after a bombing or a stabbing, I would ask them, do you actually feel safer here? Because I don't really ever have rockets being launched at me where I grew up, or have to worry about not standing at the bus stop because someone might drive a car into it because we've kicked them out of their family's house. And they would say yes, but I never believed them because everyone was walking around the city with an automatic weapon. And until very recently, you didn't see that where I grew up in D.C. It seemed quite obvious to me that their act of settler colonialism of moving to Israel and displacing the Palestinian population had put them in danger when they could have just stayed in the United States and been a lot safer. Settler colonialism throughout history has in fact put the settlers in dangerous situations. Settler colonialism mostly harms indigenous people, but it does exploit settlers by placing them in engineered danger to advance elite interest. Settlers are instruments strategically deployed by states, empires, and private interests that benefits from their presence while remaining insulated from the consequences. For example, on the North American frontier, settlers were encouraged and often incentivized to occupy the contested borderlands. This wasn't just westward movement, it was a deliberate strategy by land companies, territorial government, and federal policymakers. Settlers served as human buffers, absorbing the risk of frontier conflict while creating facts on the ground that justified military intervention. When violence erupted, political leaders cited settler suffering as evidence that indigenous nations were hostile, therefore legitimizing new campaigns of conquest. The insecurity settlers' experience was not incidental. It was structurally useful. A frontier in crisis created the political conditions for expansion. In South Africa, European settlers constructed a political order designed to secure permanent dominance over a black majority. Settlers benefited from this structure. They controlled the land, the industry, and the state. But maintaining a minority rule required a level of coercion that ultimately destabilized the settlers themselves. To preserve the system, the apartheid government built one of the most extensive security states of the 20th century. It relied on surveillance networks, emergency laws, militarized policing, and compulsory conscription. These tools were designed to control the black population, let me be clear, but they also reshaped settler life. White South Africans lived in a society defined by fear, militarization, and international isolation. Sanctions eroded the economy. Mandatory military service sent young white men into brutal conflicts. The state's obsession with security created a political culture where dissent, even among the white settlers, was treated as a threat. Even when settlers benefited from apartheid, they were trapped inside a system that demanded constant vigilance, constant repression, and constant fear. These mechanisms were designed to maintain their dominance, but became mechanisms that constrained their own lives. South Africa reveals a core truth about settler colonialism. The same structures that enforce domination also create a trap for the settlers themselves. I'm not saying we should shed a bunch of tears for Americans who now live in Tel Aviv. Rather, I feel like to gain a full understanding of settled colonial states, we have to understand the motive and mechanisms of the state along with the settlers. The fact that the state does not care about the safety of the settlers does not absolve them of their own part in the violence. Whether their motive is ideological or material, or a combination of both, they remain responsible for their actions. The genocide of the indigenous people could not happen without the settlers, regardless of how the state treats the settlers. Settlements in the West Bank are placed in strategic Palestinian population centers along key transportation corridors. These locations are chosen for political and territorial leverage. The risks these settlers face are not incidental. They are the direct consequences of a strategy that uses civilian presence to assert control over land. And when these settlers experience violence, it does not weaken the system, it strengthens it. When settlers are attacked, the state responds with familiar sequences. They increase the military presence. They expand the checkpoints and road closures. They add new security infrastructure. They authorize additional settlement construction and reframe it as an expansion of the protection of the settlements that are already there. In this way, the vulnerability of the settlers becomes a justification to create new settlements. The logic is circular. The settlements create the insecurity. The insecurity justified more settlements. More settlements creates more insecurity. It doesn't just occur in the West Bank. Along Israel's southern border lies a cluster of communities known as the Gaza envelope. The kibbutzes and small towns are situated just meters from the Gaza border. These communities are not accidental. They were built here beginning in the 1940s and 50s to serve as a frontier outpost anchoring Israeli presence along the contested Gaza border. The Gaza envelope was designed as a human buffer zone, a line of civilian presence that reinforces the territorial claims and provides strategic depth. The kibbutzim were placed to hold the line, both symbolically and physically. Kfar Aza, Nahal Oz, these towns that faced the most destruction on October 7, 2023, had purposely been placed as civilian communities in contested space, opening them up to threats of violence. These kibbutzes were not simply victims of geography. They were part of a strategic architecture in which civilian presence was used to anchor borders and reinforcement of the narrative that the frontier must be held at all cost.
In a briefing to journalists, Israeli military officials said an estimated 70,000 Palestinians were killed during the war.
There may be a ceasefire deal on paper, but the airstrikes have not stopped in Gaza.
Dozens of settlers fanning out across the hills. We watched them break into buildings, methodically setting fire to vehicles and homes.
The excuse the Israelis like to give for pretty much any of the horrible things they do is that they're doing it to protect Jewish people, whether it's any of the military actions that the state of Israel carries out or how they treated me in the airport. That's always the excuse. And we can have a conversation about that. A state that is literally putting Jewish people in the line of fire like human shields or cannon fodder. I don't think it was really protecting the Jewish people. To me, the entire experience was summed up after I was interrogated and stripped and demeaned because I had been caught at a border with my Palestinian boyfriend, who was an Israeli citizen, by the way. That didn't matter. What mattered is that he was Palestinian. And then I was greeted by the store of a Nazi. The sin of Nazism was willing to be excused because he had goods to sell. But my sin of having a Palestinian ex-boyfriend was unforgivable to the Israelis.
I'm at En-Gedi. I'm just hiding in this cave until the large group of small children who are harassing me because of my shirt pass. They're like 8.
To me, everything you need to know about Israel is summed up in the fact that there is a Hugo Boss in the Tel Aviv airport.